Welcome to Therapy Facts with Dr. Jenn. Today we are talking about the Diddy Cassie video, which depicted domestic violence. We're talking about point number 5, which is helping the domestic violence perpetrator through intervention. Before we defined domestic violence, we talked about who was the most likely to be a victim. We talked about how to help victims. We talked about the characteristics of perpetrators. We talked about helping perpetrators through prevention. So today we are talking about helping perpetrators through intervention. And it really comes down to this. It comes down to if you have a person who is already engaged in domestic violence, and especially if they're older adult, but even teenagers and young adults, is if you see something, say something. So very often we will see domestic violence being perpetrated right before our very eyes, and we will turn our heads because the idea is that, oh, that's somebody else's business. That's not my business. Well, guess what? Domestic violence is the business of anybody in the community, and it is your business if you see it, because everybody in the community is negatively affected by domestic violence, whether or not we are the perpetrator or the victim. And we are the victim if we are witness to it. So very often people don't realize that even adults, young adults and teenagers who may not seem to be listening, especially to elders and even peers, can be very much influenced if someone speaks up on their negative behavior. So if you see, as a parent, you see your child, male or female, perpetrating domestic violence, either subtle, because now you know what the subtle looks like, all the way up to the overt, and you don't say anything, then you are a co-conspirator, especially if you're a parent. Now, the way you say something to someone, you don't have to deliver your observations. Simply saying something to someone involves making an observation. You don't have to deliver your observation with the same intensity or energy that the person is delivering their domestic violence. If you see or you hear your son say something negative to someone he's dating or otherwise in an intimate relationship, calls them a name, calls them fat, says something to them that is inappropriately toned, has an inappropriate tone, or embarrasses them in front of other people. Like I said, all kinds of subtle tactics to undermine their self-esteem, to increase their self-consciousness, to decrease their self-confidence. If you see anything like that, making an observation, oh, son, and you don't necessarily have to do it in public, but if he delivers it in public, then you could deliver it in public. But if you decide not to, pull them aside and say, hey, I saw what you said, or I saw what you did, or I heard what you did. What was that? What was the meaning? Were you intending to build her up in that way? If you see your daughter doing anything similar, again, if they do it in public, you could do it in public. But if you want to pull them aside because you want them to maintain their dignity, even though they're trying to undermine someone else's dignity, say something. If you see, and again, we're talking about helping the perpetrator right here. A lot of times we focus on helping the victim, but the perpetrator needs some help as well. If you see your loved one, your child, your grandchild, your niece, your nephew, your cousin, your brother, your sister, getting so involved with someone that there's a level of enmeshment, and there's a level of anger, and there's a level of, oh, I can't live without this person, for you to be able to say, hey, what is that about? Is that healthy? Is that something that is working for you? Is that something that's building you up? Is that something that's building the other person up? Again, broach the question, broach the observation, because sometimes people can be so caught up in their emotions, and we know it. It doesn't take anything much more than intense emotions to stop us from thinking straight, right? So if you see someone with these intense emotions that also seem to be associated with negative behavior, unhealthy relationship behavior, pull them aside minimally and say, hey, what's going on? Do you realize that every time you bring your guy to a family gathering, that you end up belittling him, you end up embarrassing him? Heck, you embarrass us. It's hard to watch. Do you realize that you are doing that every time you come to a family gathering? And then if you do, what do you think that is doing for him? What do you think that is doing for us who have to witness that? Like, I feel like I am negatively impacted by the way you treat him, right? Is that your goal? Right? Just having these questions, not making accusations, but sharing your observations. I notice every time I call you and so comes in the room or comes home or comes over, you have to immediately end your conversation. Did you know that was happening? Do you know why you are doing that? Is that building up the relationship? Is that building you up? Right? What is happening that you are requiring you and yourself and this other person to be so isolated? We invite you to this and that, and we heard that she's not going to her family events either. What is happening with the isolation? So again, asking questions, and then if you see something that's strictly violent or overtly violent, to intervene on it. If your loved one strikes someone in your presence, that's an immediate public intervention. Hey, what is happening? Is there a need for an additional level of intervention now that you have decided to strike this person in the presence of other people? What's going on? So you see marks or you see evidence of aggression, and you ask the perpetrator, the person that you believe is the perpetrator, what is happening? Because we don't say anything, and the person gets the idea of, even if it's approved, nobody's going to say anything. And if the perpetrator is involved in a loving village, then he or she should be held accountable to their disruptive behavior. Because again, having to watch, if you see things either publicly or not so public, but you see evidence, having to be exposed to that's a form of violence as well. And so you get to speak up. And if you have any relationship or any love for the person that the perpetrator again is victimizing, whether you have love for them or not, but especially if you do, then you have a right as a loving member of the village to speak up and say, hey, what's going on? And if you're someone who that your loved one or your child has watched you be in the same situation, either as a victim or a perpetrator, and hopefully you've been delivered from that circumstance, you get to speak up. You get to speak up and say, hey, I know that you saw the same thing going on with us, but that's not right. It's not right, because it wasn't right then when I was experiencing it or when I was doing it, and it ain't right now. Because here's what we know for sure from research. There are a lot more people who will be negatively impacted from domestic violence than is thought or is meant. That domestic violence will end up hurting someone that the perpetrator and the victim never even thought would be impacted. And so for that reason, for the reasons of collateral damage alone, is a reason to speak up and try to orient the perpetrator, in particular for this video, to what is happening, to what you're witnessing, finding out what's going on with them, and helping them to understand that, hey, the buck of what you're doing does not stop where you think and where you intend it. So again, if you see something, say something.